We're all aware that in just 9 days, Season 3 of The Living World is getting dropped into Guild Wars 2. The first big patch, supposedly one of roughly 6 of these every year, will be coming. And while a lot of us are excited about the fact we're finally going to get new content to play, obviously that means the big question on our mind is, what the hell is that content going to involve? For the next couple of videos, I'm going to dedicate to speculation on exactly where the story could be going, the kind of locations we go to, the characters we could find involved, and also, quite importantly, the mechanical things that ArenaNet might introduce or expand on in this season of The Living World. A lot's different about Guild Wars 2 compared to when they first started Season 1, when they started Season 2, and obviously since the expansion Heart of Thorns, and so that could mean we're in for a slightly different ride to what we may have been expecting in the past, and that to me makes things all the more interesting. So today, specifically, we're fixating on the locations. I have quite a few different places that I think the story might go. 3 big key possibilities I want to dive into more than anything else, but also a lot of other little areas too. For those that never really played the previous Living World seasons, they actually involved a fair amount of globe-trotting. Yes, Season 2 of The Living World introduced 2 new maps to the game, both in the same general area of the world, Drytop and the Silver Waste, but it also had a lot of story taking place in other areas like the Dermond Priory or various places among the Shiver Peaks and Ascalon. And so the first thing I'd like to dive into for this video is the fact that though Season 3 is likely to add a new map, it's not necessarily going to be in all of the likely areas we will travel to. And what exactly are those areas? Well, number one, I would say we need to look at the Pact. Now, at the end of the Heart of Thorns storyline, the fate of the Pact was a little up for grabs. We didn't quite know what was going on. Obviously, the leader of the Pact, Marshal Traherne, was killed in the concluding moments of Heart of Thorns, and that's going to mean something has to change among its members. Places like Fort Trinity, therefore, might be places we actually visit, or the various Order headquarters, as people struggle to figure out how the Pact's going to function without Traherne at its head. During the personal story, we actually saw 3 prominent characters from each of the Orders, like Dern or Warmaster of Foot, that were kind of second to Traherne, along with us, the player character, and I think we might actually see these guys sort of step up. So Season 3 of The Living World is probably going to take us maybe to Fort Trinity, or again the Orders, so that we can deal with that. But again, I don't think that's going to be related to necessarily a new map or a major focus of the story. Likewise, I think you can say a similar thing here to the Norn areas, and specifically Holbrak in the Shiver Peaks, because of another key character death in Heart of Thorns, that of Heir Stegalkin. So Heir did get a little bit of a period in the Heart of Thorns story for us to mourn her. You guys probably remember the bit where we press F to pay our respects, but really, that wasn't enough. One of the biggest criticisms of Heart of Thorns was that it didn't give us enough time to grieve for these characters or give emotional time to some of the biggest moments, and I think that Season 3 of The Living World is going to pick up on that. In fact, I'd put my money on the very start of this season being us hanging out in Holbrak and mourning this very key character. A lot of Norn back at Holbrak also recognize her. It's not just a matter of Bram, so I think we could have some kind of big send-off for her. That's where it will begin. But how much more Shiver Peak stuff will happen after that? I don't know. It could be that the next Elder Dragon we go for is going to be Jormag. There's a lot of reason to believe this. Even back in the personal story, there were a lot of hints that Jormag would be the next Elder Dragon, and then it became Morgemoth, and that this may have been what the Pact were actually focusing on. But what you need to look at especially is the fact that the Norn were pushed out of their homelands, and they have been waiting for the day to retake it from the dragon, and now they've seen 2 of these Elder Dragons have recently been killed. If that doesn't galvanize them, I don't know what will. But all that said, I think it's fairly unlikely that is going to be the immediate focus of Living World Season 3, though they might allude to it in small ways here and there. The next small area as well, and I'm not going to go into full detail on this, but is actually Rata Novus with Timey. We did get that blog post with Timey recently, where she even referenced the Holbrak stuff, by the way, and Brown, the fact that he's upset about his mother. But there is suggestion to believe that maybe there are a lot more Asuran characters who know a lot more about the Elder Dragons than we realize still at Rata Novus, and there could be time in Season 3 for us to deal with these characters and go back there. But again, I actually don't think it's as major as I maybe once upon a time did. I have an entire video dedicated to this mystery and what's going on. You can click the link on screen right now if you want to check that out before returning back, and we'll talk about some of the other areas. But that's a definite possible location. It's just not something I think we're going to linger on too much for the entirety of the season. Last of all, as well, something that gets a look in from even before Heart of Thorns came out, you guys may remember that once upon a time, ArenaNet shifted the position of Ratasum on the world map down to make space for a potential map north of it. So if you look here on the world map, it does seem like there could have been a location, this could have been a location for an area. Before Heart of Thorns came out, there was a lot of speculation that maybe this would be a Heart of Thorns map, but it never ended up being one. One of the big things I'm going to express to you guys here is I think what ArenaNet might like to do is position a lot of their Living World Season 3 maps here in the westernmost reaches of the land, the southwesternmost reaches of the land, because Season 3 Living World content is only accessible if you own Heart of Thorns. Therefore, it kind of makes sense to think they might add a new map for us that is directly accessible from a Heart of Thorns map, so there's not too much confusion for free-to-play players or people who only own core Tyria. And so it does kind of make sense, continuing with this fact that they did move Ratasum down south a little to maybe make more room, that this could still be a map we eventually get to go to, but where the story precedent is for that, well, that's a little bit more unclear. Some people have broken out of one of the guild halls, the Gilded Hollow, and suggested that there are hints up there that there might be a map here, a desert kind of map, but I personally am of the opinion that speculations on that line are a little too obscure to actually mean something. Finally, in terms of little areas and small things I might expect to let us go to in Season 3 of the Living World, before we get to the big juicy stuff, are the cut areas of Dragon's Stand. Now, when Heart of Thorns originally came out, there was an achievement for exploring Dragon's Stand, the final map of the expansion, where you could unfog various areas. But the thing is, there were a couple of areas for Dragon's Stand that seemed that they were going to have content in them, got cut before the game came out, but the achievement was never updated. And what do I mean by this? Well, I mean, if you as a player fully explored Dragon's Stand when Heart of Thorns came out, you still wouldn't have the achievement. It would be telling you to go to these other areas that were completely inaccessible and devoid of content. There's a suggestion that there was supposed to be a fourth attack line in the Dragon's Stand meta event before you fight the mouth of Mordred Moth at the end, relating to the Nightmare Court, and one of these Nightmare Court characters we'll talk about a little bit later. But none of that stuff ended up making it, and eventually ArenaNet updated the achievement to reflect that fact. But there's still a chance that those areas of the map will now find use in Living World Season 3, and those will be places we actually get to go, because honestly, the geography of that area of the world really could use a little bit more of an explanation, and again, it kind of fits with the idea that maybe that would be the entrance to another map, similar to how they dealt with Brisbane Wildlands and updated it to eventually add Dry Top after that. So, those are the little things. I want to talk in broad strokes now about the biggest places I think the season in general can go. Because, yeah, those small speculations I just made might have some high amount of accuracy to them, but they're not particularly exciting. So what about beyond the first few patches? What about when we're in Living World Season 3, Episode 9? Where's the story taking us to? What's ArenaNet pushing us for? Well, I think that there are 3 big areas for this. Don't forget that Living World seasons seem to be kind of setting up new expansions. They won't necessarily have us kill an Elder Dragon, therefore, but they might take us to some smaller regions of the world or onto the doorsteps of the domain of an Elder Dragon, just as we saw Dry Top and the Silver Waste did. They took us closer to the Maguma Jungle, where the Maguma Jungle itself was what the expansion was dealing with. So with that in mind, my first major thing is something I've expressed before, and that is the idea of the Crystal Desert. So, why do I say the Crystal Desert? The Crystal Desert in Guild Wars 1 was a location that we could go in the original release of the game, Prophecies, where basically one big thing happened, and that was that the player characters learned how to ascend. The storyline right now in Guild Wars 2 has reintroduced a race known as the Massart, who should, technically speaking, be totally invisible to us. Maybe just this one Massart character is the only one that's going to be part of the story, but certainly if they're going to be more, the way you combat being this invisibility, the way that the characters got to see this race of spellcasters from the previous game, was that they had to go to the Crystal Desert and become ascended. I think there is good chance that the same thing might happen in Guild Wars 2. The Crystal Desert, by the way, is a fan favorite area from the original original Prophecies release that many people in the earliest days of Guild Wars 2's development still expected us to go to. The Guild Wars 2 personal story references it a couple of occasions. For example, one of the Sylvari personal story steps talks about a ritual having been learned in the Crystal Desert, and even in Season 2 of The Living World, we get many references to it and the rituals of Ascension when we learn about Glint, when we travel to Glint's lair, and lastly, when we perform a kind of pretend version of what the players spent oh so long doing in the Crystal Desert. Also touched on in a pretty major way in Season 2 and Heart of Thorns was the race The Forgotten. The Forgotten were a snake-like race of creatures you got to meet in Guild Wars 1 who had once been the stewards and shepherds of life on the world, watching over Tyria, but slowly their influence on the world had receded and receded and receded until they only existed where? The Crystal Desert. Their ultimate fate after that, in the 250 years between the first game and the second, has not explicitly been said to us. So, the idea may be that we get to interact a little bit more with Forgotten, especially considering the Forgotten are the architects of the Exalted, an entirely new race of creatures that we met in the most recent expansion, Heart of Thorns. So there's a lot of reason to go to the Crystal Desert, a lot of fan desire to go to the Crystal Desert, a lot of story reason to go to the Crystal Desert. Another idea that I've been talking about for a while is the idea of Destiny's Edge, our 5 main iconic racial characters. These characters are kind of hanging a little bit on the sidelines right now, and they need a good conclusion to their story before it feels weird and jarring when they finally return to battle the Elder Dragon that once defeated them so long ago. So it makes a lot of sense that ArenaNet might want to deal with these characters as soon as possible, and of course this all then suggests that maybe the next Elder Dragon we'll fight is Kraukatoric, but again, I don't think it's fair to say that will happen in the living world at any stretch of the imagination. Area number 2, and I think this one is incredibly likely, would be areas in Kryta, specifically to the north of Kryta. There's an awful lot of things to discuss here. First of all, I'll start with the most basic, obvious one, the oldest hint that the game might expand to areas north in Kryta, and that would be the Bandit Bridge in Brisbane Wildlands. Let's rewind the clock to the start of Season 2, shall we? Season 2, we knew that we were going to get a new map. We didn't quite know where we'd get a new map, but people were looking at areas of Tyria from the launch of the game that seemed to suggest new maps might extend off of them. For example, Mount Maelstrom is one of them that seems to suggest a map south a little, perhaps towards the Crystal Desert, but the best map to look at was definitely Brisbane Wildlands. In Brisbane Wildlands, there was a giant bandit fort with a mysterious portal behind it, and in Season 2, eventually, not only did they open up that fort, giving us a new map, but they also expanded Brisbane Wildlands to the south of it too, giving us a new map there as well, Drytop. But Brisbane Wildlands isn't quite done yet. See, despite that fort that was there at the launch of the game and suggested a new map, to actually get visibility on the exit to the map that was being hinted at by the devs in the fort, you kind of had to break out of the map and do some obscure stuff specifically to see it. However, in the north of Brisbane Wildlands, plain for all to see, no matter who's doing map completion, without having to do any weird trickery breaking out of the map, everyone, since the release of the game, has been able to see a group of bandits building a broken bridge. And on the other side of said broken bridge, to a presumably northern Krytan map, is a portal leading somewhere new. Of course, if you do break out of the map and get across the bridge, which isn't too hard to do, and you try and walk into the portal, nothing happens, it doesn't load you anywhere. But basically the point is this, that ArenaNet have been suggesting to us since 2012 that they want to add a map up north there. This is further confirmed by an old developer interview that suggested at the release of the game they actually wanted a map to the west of Queensdale, which would be this map. And so, since they filled in the Bandit Fort in Season 2, it's not a crazy thing to imagine they might fill in this map to the north of Brisbane for Season 3, is it? It goes even deeper than this though, and that's because of the fact that the current raid story is dealing so heavily with Kryta and Krytan politics and places. It's not just in the raid either that we're seeing White Mantle refer to many allies of theirs and that something big might be about to happen, such as an attack on Divinity's Reach at the hands of the White Mantle, but this has even seeped over into the regular game world too. Between the release of Heart of Thorns and the start of Season 3 in just over a week away from now, ArenaNet did start dropping in small patches to the game known as current events patches. These current events patches have dealt with two things, namely, number one, leyline energy and the overflow of magic affecting the world since Morgemoth's defeat, and presumably before that Zaitan's defeat as well contributing to this, but also Kryta and the White Mantle and the activities of the bandits. It's not just in the raids that ArenaNet are sincerely seeming to suggest we're gonna be getting more White Mantle story. They're making this obvious for everyone playing the game right now, including things like tearing down sheets of propaganda that teach people about the White Mantle in the very most recent patch that they've put in there. Still further substantiation on this topic, in Season 2 of The Living World, one of the weird, outstanding, peculiar mysteries was that ArenaNet in one mission established the existence of an amulet that could tell you the true heir to the human throne. And it was kind of had a little bit of a spotlight shine on it, and then it's disappeared and not been touched on since. Seems kind of weird that the devs would have done that. Well, a lot of people now think that maybe they explained this amulet to us so that it can pay off later, such as, oh, I don't know, if there's going to be a big White Mantle attack on the city and the Queen dies, and oh, hey, guess what? This now has actually become relevant. Then there's even more stuff from the launch of the game. It's not just about that bandit bridge. People have long known about a map that was going to exist north of Divinity's Reach and wrap around Divinity's Reach, known as Lake Doric. I myself have done a video on Lake Doric before. You can click the link if you want to have a look at it, like the development version of that map. It's never been something players can actually access. More recently, a lot of people have been hit with a bug in the game where if they get map completion on a specific map, they'll get a double reward. I got this just the other day when I got world completion, where you get a reward for Lake Doric. Lake Doric still exists in our game clients. Is it such a stretch to think, though this isn't connected to that bandit bridge I mentioned earlier, admittedly, is it such a stretch to think we might get another Kryta map north of Divinity's Reach now, from way back at the development of the initial game, that expands more on White Mantle storylines? And then what about Divinity's Reach itself? Divinity's Reach itself, once upon a time, was the host of a district known as the Great Collapse, and in the Great Collapse we found a giant hole that bored into the depths of Thea of Divinity's Reach. When you spoke and listened to many of the NPCs around this area, they seemed to suggest there was some kind of conspiracy theory or cover-up from people higher up in DR. Could this then perhaps be related to the White Mantle? Are we actually going to get answers on this now, especially considering that the Great Collapse was replaced by the Crown Pavilion and the Queen's Jubilee is coming up soon? You know, I can't help but think about the fact that the developers pointed out with their raids that they might like to add just the odd wing here or there in various areas around the world. Each of the main cities at the launch of Guild Wars 2 seemed to suggest there was going to be some kind of a dungeon associated with them, and it strikes me that initially that was going to have something to do with the Great Collapse and the Drakes in the sewer and maybe some of these locations we hear about in the first novel for Guild Wars 2. But none of that stuff was ever really touched on, and now we have this comment from the devs they might add a random wing in here or there. Could they add a random new thing for the raid development to be the sewers and the depths of Divinity's Reach? Somehow we are tasked with thwarting the White Mantle attempts to sabotage the people of the city in an attempt to kill the Queen, similar to, you know, the attempts on Parliament and Guy Fawkes Day in my own country. Well, maybe now we're going a little bit down the rabbit hole, but suffice it to say there's a lot of evidence, a lot of untapped potential in the Krytan areas of Guild Wars 2. Kryta is a region, by the way, that doesn't even have a high-level map associated with it, while many other regions of the game actually do have a high-level map associated with them. So maybe this is ArenaNet's chance to finally drop that in. And third, and finally, for the big areas it seems very likely we might end up being able to travel to, is the Fire Island chain. Now, there is less evidence to support the Fire Island chain, but once again, it comes down to what the most prominent storylines are with Guild Wars 2 right now, and what Heart of Thorns touched on, but never finished with. So the first thing to express here is, once again, the Massart. So the Massart, yes, are perhaps back in the story, at least one of them is, and he might have many more friends out there somewhere. Guild Wars 1 established the fact that there was a significant base of operations ran by the Massart in the Fire Island chain. This race of creatures never originally came from that area of the world, but they were well established there, and they were well established there for a great reason. A prophecy had been foretold that spelled the end of their race if the Door of Kamali located on the Fire Island chain were ever to open. So they invested significant amounts of time on keeping it closed with their Door of Kamali. The last we saw this in the game was at the release of original Guild Wars 1, where the volcanoes erupted and we were forced away. In the 250 years between the two games, the geography just based on the world map art is completely different there now. But perhaps if the Massart are coming back into the story, it may key into this a little. But far more than that, because that's a pretty flimsy connection to make, we have Ritlock. Now, Ritlock is a very important character for several reasons. The first I'd like to talk about is the fact he seems to be a major player in Season 3 already. Why do I say this? Well, about a month or so ago, ArenaNet threw a poll out to the community so that they could assign a name to the new band of adventuring heroes we've come to know after Destiny's Edge sort of moved out of the picture. And when they allowed us to name this crew, they listed Ritlock Brimstone as a core member of that group, which is quite curious, and it at least suggests that he's going to have a lot more to do in the future. Beyond this, Ritlock had a major focus in Heart of Thorns. Several mysteries were pointed to at many occasions throughout that storyline, and Ritlock gave us no details on them, much to the criticism of the writing team for the original release of the expansion. What are these mysteries? Well, what the hell Ritlock did while he was in the Mists, and specifically who he's been communing with and how he functions as a Revenant since he left the Mists, how he got blinded. These are answers I think we'll get from Ritlock. Now, how does that tie to the Fire Island chain? Well, I think they may be related to one of his other long-standing mysteries, how he got his legendary sword Sahothin, which originally had been in the hands of Prince Rurik of the Humans. Prince Rurik died where? Well, the Fire Island chain. So Ritlock clearly has some backstory associated with this area. I think ArenaNet might tie these mysteries together in a nice, satisfying way, and whatever it is, if it's related to the Fire Island chain, we could end up finding ourselves there again. I'd also like to come back a little bit to the discussion I made earlier, and that is on the idea of the new Living World maps connecting to existing Heart of Thorns maps, and the general idea of this expansion bundling and giving us access to many areas in the southwest of the world. If we did, in Living World Season 3, get access to the Fire Island chain, it would make a lot of sense because these areas are geographically close to the Maguma Jungle maps that we were in, especially Dragon's Stand, right towards the end of the game. It doesn't defy belief to think that somewhere after Dragon's Stand there's a little passageway to a dock or something, and then we sail down to the Fire Island chain. And then, finally, there's one other thing to look at, and that's on the way that narrative is going to be constructed in Guild Wars 2. See, the Fire Island chain does have a few vague reasons for us to head to it, probably the existence of a Bloodstone there being one of the biggest ones for current storylines, but outside of that, there really isn't much reason that devs in the future will give us to head to this location. Unless they take this opportunity now, at this moment at the end of Heart of Thorns, to give us a real reason to head to that location, it's gonna stick out forevermore as this weird area we kind of want to go to, but nobody really knows why, and they have to invent an entirely new reason for our journeys to that place. It makes most sense right now, and any other time, if they want to make us go there, it's just gonna feel a bit wonky and weird and feel like it's just an excuse to head to that region rather than a natural development within the story. So I say the Fire Island chain does have a high chance for us to go to it. It's even got the benefit of the fact it's not a particularly large area at all. 2-3 maps max to explore the entire area. That sounds exactly like the kind of scope a Living World season can handle, doesn't it? Especially considering the fact the game's already got a lot of fiery assets by the way of Mount Maelstrom and the volcanic fractal and so on and so forth. So, those are the 3 large areas I think we may end up going to. Of course, there is a chance that a mix and match of any of those could be true. And then the last little place I would like to bring your attention to, once again, lies in the raid and the way that they designed the Forsaken Thicket as a map. So for those that haven't been raiding, don't really know about this, there's an area to the north of Verdant Brink, one of the Heart of Thorns maps right now, that you can only access and explore if you are raiding. That map is split into 3 separate wings, each with their own loading screen and area on them. But eventually the entire size of that map is pretty much comparable to a new open world map. But only raiders have been able to go there. And for most of the story in the raid, many of us expected that we'd end up at the location of the Maguma Jungle Bloodstone. But that isn't what happened in the end. Instead of treating this as a normal big rectangular map like they do with so many others, ArenaNet actually ended the raid before we got to visit the Bloodstone. And that area of the map still remains unexplored. So I actually think they've done this for a very important reason. I think the reason they've done it is so that everyone in Living World Season 3 can visit that Bloodstone through a different alternate entrance to that area of the world because it is so important for the story and they don't want to gate it behind, you know, just this small community of people participating in this incredibly difficult content. I think we may actually see a little entrance to that appear at the top of Verdant Brink at some point in the future. Though does that really count as a major new map? Probably not, but I'm pretty certain it will be a thing. And so that's pretty much it, guys. I would like to close the video with a couple of other things, though, and these are places that I think are much less likely for us to head to. Now, one of them immediately is the Isles of Thea. Now, this place could be appearing on a lot of people's lists because, well, there's obviously a high amount of White Mantle influence going to be happening in Living World Season 3. I haven't been exactly clear about this, despite the fact we've talked about them a lot, but even the promo art from Season 3 is already showing White Mantle soldiers from Facebook, so it's fairly obvious. And because it seems that the Isles of Thea have some relation to the White Mantle storylines and ethics or religion, perhaps then we'll end up getting to go there. It's kind of like a further extension on what I've been saying in this video of, hey, maybe we could go north of the Divinity's Reach, past Lake Doric and so forth. But the Isles of Thea are so far away, I find it a little harder to swallow that we may get there in Living World Season 3. Maybe the devs do want us to move to that area of the world, but I feel like it's just a little out of scope compared to some of the other places we could go to. But then I did put, you know, the entrance to the Crystal Desert on there, and maybe that's just as difficult to swallow as that. So it's definitely possible, it's just not at the top of my list. You know, the fact that this first patch is called Out of the Shadows, and it was the White Mantle that just came out of the shadows, definitely does put us into a world where the Isles of Thea are more likely than not. There's also, by the way, the Fractals storyline, which I'm not discussing in this video. The fact we're actually going to get some kind of narrative going forward there is very cool. And the first Fractal we're going to go as a part of that narrative is called the Chaos Isles. And the Chaos Isles could be referring to the Isles of Thea, way back when Zaitan died, because of what we heard in that weird Italian interview from E3, where ArenaNet were showing members of the press actual Season 3 stuff. But again, are we maybe wearing tinfoil hats here? Who knows? Moving on, I want to talk about a couple of predictions I've made in the past that I'm now dropping completely. And sod's law is that now that I'm finally dropping these, they'll come true. But here's what I want to talk about. Malik and his pale tree. At the start of Season 2 of The Living World, and before at the start of Heart of Thorns, both of these big areas, I predicted that we would find the second pale tree of the Sylvari. We'd find where Malik had gone, we'd find his people, find his armies, and there'd be some kind of story there. Well, it never happened in Season 2, it never happened in Heart of Thorns, and I'm finally going to take it off the table. I don't see that it may happen here. I think we're going far too heavy on sort of a Massar White Mantle-y angle than anything else. We'll see, it may be the first thing in the first patch, but for now, I don't know how quickly Living World Season 3 is going to go into it. Now, let me be clear. I think Malik himself does have a very high chance of appearing, and we'll talk about that more in an upcoming video. But his actual second pale tree, I'm hesitant to speculate on any further. The only chance we'll get for this, the closest I'll come, is that if that map north of Ratasum ends up being a thing, that's the most likely place the second tree would be, I guess. But it's been so long now, I'm just going to stop trying to guess at when it comes. This is in the video to tell you guys, keep it in mind. That's all. Another thing a lot of people have been discussing, and especially considering I did a stupid video earlier in the week about the sword Caladbolg, I've discussed too, is the possibility of Ore being a place we'll head to. There are conspiracy theories that Ore was corrupted somehow by Morgemoth, that Morgemoth may have moved his mind to Ore and may continue to exist just over there now and people don't realize. These are all fun ideas, but I don't see us going to Ore for any really long period of time, except for maybe right on the borders of it at Fort Trinity again to deal with the fallout of the Pact. I think anything majorly to do with Ore, they would have set up a little bit more for it before we go there. Maybe one day, but probably not Season 3. And then the other area as well is the Shiver Peaks. This is the last thing to talk about, really. Again, I think we will end up going there for a bit. The Raid Wing did show us these paintings of mountainscapes. We do have lore suggesting that there's a Bloodstone Shard there in the Shiver Peak somewhere. But does that mean we're going to get entirely new maps and a big focus on Shiver Peaks areas? We're going to be going north there. Again, I think is a little too thin on the ground. And I'd be very surprised if the first Living World Season 3 map is actually there in the Shiver Peaks. So that's about it, guys. Those are the biggest possibilities. That's kind of how I rank them. That's where I am, where my mind is. Hopefully you're excited by some of these ideas. Do keep an eye on the channel, because in just a few days, I want to talk about the characters we could meet, where these, personal stories may actually end up going. And also, I want to talk about things like masteries, the way they're going to structure their meta events, the kind of features we might get with Living World Season 3, and so forth. So thanks very much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. It's good to have stuff to talk about, eh? Have a good evening, and I'll see you next time. Want to see his father in this state. and was afraid of what it all meant. Borge turned his palm up and spread his thick, worn fingers. "Come here." Bare feet silent on the pine floor, Braham crossed the distance to stand beside the fur-covered bed. He made every effort to sound strong as he said, "I'm here." He put his small hand on his father's arm. His skin stood starkly against his father's darker tone. He'd been told he was a mix of light and dark, his mother having had snowy skin and his father with his brown bare colouring. It had never bothered Bram until that moment, when he wished more than anything that he could blend more smoothly with his father, be more like him, the great warrior, the legendary hero